Hello again from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. Happy and blessed Christmas Eve, which in this part of the world is about to change already into Christmas Day. Canada's Arab Muslim students who face racism, racial stereotyping because of their religion and because of their ethnicity demand a globalized curriculum in order to combat these prejudices and racial stereotypes. The author Wissam K.H. Abdul Jabbar, who is now serving as an adjunct professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Alberta. Interestingly enough, Alberta politically and socially has been Canada's most conservative province since 1935. Because since 1935, for 80 years, out of those 84 years that have passed, Alberta has had either a right-wing or a center-right government. So whether a social credit government or a progressive conservative government, or since this April, a united conservative government. Only for 4 years, from 2015 until the spring of 2019, has Alberta had a center-left provincial government, a new democratic government. So we would expect that in Alberta, there are more open racial prejudices against and religious and ethnic prejudices against the Arab Muslim students than there would be, for example, in the socially and culturally more liberal and diverse Ontario. Never mind the fact that also Ontario has had mostly right-wing or center-right governments since 1905. However, it did have a center-left government from 1990 to 1995 under former New Democratic Premier Bob Rae, who since then, or in the early years of this century, switched over to the Liberals. And from 2003 to 2018, it had successive Liberal governments under Premiers Dalton McGuinty and Kathleen Wynne. So this professor writes, I was a full-time high school teacher in an Ontario Islamic school in 2008 when I noticed that my Arab Muslim students led lives of religious conformity at school that reflected their Islamic values at home but did not necessarily define their full selves. For example, many students who wore the hijab, which is the traditional Muslim head cover for girls and women, or who prayed at the required times, were skeptical of beliefs parents and teachers expected them to take for granted, like creationism. So in the Muslim context, it means the belief that Allah, the Muslim God, created the world. In the Christian context, of course, it means that the triune God, Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit created the world. And in the Jewish context, except for the Messianic Jewish context, which recognizes the triune nature of God, it would mean that Yahweh created the world. In the Hindu context, of course, it would mean the belief that the gods, because Hinduism is a polytheistic religion, created the world. In Buddhism, it would mean that, well, whoever is the deity created the world, because most Buddhists do not believe in a personal God. At the same time, they studied the Ontario provincial curriculum, and they were equally unsure if this curriculum resonated with how they see themselves in the world. This educator did not feel the curriculum reflected traditional Islamic ways of knowing, which are related to infinite wonder and wondering, and also resonate with Western contemporary ways of knowing. When this professor moved to Edmonton, Alberta, to start his PhD at the University of Alberta, he was invited by the university's outreach program to give cultural bridge building workshops at high schools about topics like Islam and politics. Through these experiences, and also through his encounters with people he met through the Muslim community of Edmonton, or MCE Mosque, he noticed Edmonton high school students had similar issues to his former students. And he decided to learn more by gauging Muslim Arab Canadian high school students' responses to literary texts relevant to their ethnic identity. Research about youth in Islamic schools in Canada shaped his questions. He gave 11 public school students a selection of Arab Anglophone short stories and poems. Then he interviewed them and conducted surveys with them and four more young people who chose not to be interviewed. The students' responses demonstrated a sense of double consciousness. They felt perceived as being Canadian and yet not quite. Both his interviews and surveys revealed a condition of the Arab Canadian identity as one that must constantly defend or apologize for itself. Well, no wonder, since over 18 years after 9/11, the September the 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks on the United States, in many, if not most Western countries, the attitudes towards Arabs and Muslims who are often equated with each other, even though not all Arabs are Muslims, and certainly not all Muslims are Arabs. For example, we have to remember the fact that the most populous majority Islamic country in the world is not an Arab country, but a Southeastern Asian non-Arab country, Indonesia. And we have to remember that in Western Africa, most of the residents are Black Africans, not Arabs, and yet many are Muslims. And also elsewhere in Africa, with the exception of North Africa, which is mostly both Arab and Muslim, many of the Muslims are non-Arabs. In Europe, it is true that most of the Muslims are certainly Arabs and other Middle Easterners, but a growing number of white Europeans are converting to Islam. And then here in Asia, it is true that many Muslims are Arabs, but by no means all, especially not in Southeastern Asia. In Australia and Oceania, it is true that most Muslims are of Arab or other Middle Eastern origin, like Iranian origin. And then in Latin America, most of the Muslims, probably most of the Muslims are still of Arab origin, but a significant minority are of non-Arab origin, including, let's say, African or perhaps Hispanic origin. Muslims are of Arab or other Middle Eastern origins, but by no means all. There is a significant African American Muslim community. So once again, we have to remember that neither Islam nor any other major religion in the world, call it Judaism, call it Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, or something else, is totally monolithic or homogeneous, even ethnically. And certainly not in terms of the beliefs. The irony is that two conservative Muslim countries, Saudi Arabia and Iran, have had for years poor relations, despite the fact that they both, or most of their people at least, are required to take the Quran, Islam's holy book, seriously. In Judaism, there are different denominations: Orthodox Judaism, Conservative Judaism, and Reform Judaism. In Christianity, especially on the Protestant side, there are still significant doctrinal debates and even quarrels, although much less so than before the 20th century or before the mid-20th century. Even in Hinduism, there are different strands of that religion. Some Buddhists believe in God, while most do not believe in a personal God, and so forth. The respondents said they felt stereotyped by others because of media representations of Islam. Of course, one fact that always should be noted is that most Muslims At least a clear, if not a great majority of Muslims are definitely peace-loving people who would never violently try to expand Islam, and who would only take up arms in order to defend themselves and their loved ones and their homes, their places of worship. There is, however, a small and sadly it seems to be growing minority of radicalized Muslims who then are stereotyped, especially by the right wing and populist and racist alternative media organizations, to include all or at least most Muslims. And then such right-wing politicians as the controversial Dutch politician Mr. Geert Wilders of the Party for Freedom claim that there is no such thing as a moderate Islam. I respectfully disagree. There is. It is represented, for example, by the Pakistani-born female education activist Miss Malala Yousafzai, who is a Muslim, but she's not trying, at least openly, to convert anyone to Islam. She's not advertising her religious beliefs. She's campaigning for the girls' and women's equal access to education, and rightly so. Arab Canadians, based on the findings of this study, struggle with ambivalence about the need to refute stereotypes while refusing to be defined by them. The participants expressed a desire for opportunities for interfaith, meaning interreligious and cross-cultural dialogues. Yet such opportunities are rarely available because of the lack of curriculum focused on intercultural literacy, the ability to read and respond to diverse cultures and identities in high schools. Almost all the students that this professor spoke with lamented the loss of fluency in their Arabic first language, which over time has subconsciously led to losing contact with their parents' culture. Some said Canadian children are generally raised to mature faster, and this had noticeable effects on notions of childhood and innocence. The same student referred to an act of letting go, which represents a general attitude of detachment toward one's culture and behavior. That made me let go of everything that I valued when I was just 9 years old and changed my thinking completely to fit what those other people are doing. Many of the students said Edmonton was where they attended school and made friends. And we have to remember that Edmonton is certainly not as ethnically, culturally, racially, or religiously diverse city as, for example, Toronto. After all, Edmonton is located in central Alberta, not southern Alberta, so probably Calgary would be a more diverse place in those aspects. Vancouver definitely would be, already with its large Asian Canadian community. However, school and home seemed to be conflicting spaces, so there's ambivalence about where home is. One student seemed exceedingly conscious of that doubleness, especially at school. I find it hard to, since I'm a minority at school. There were only 5 children out of 600 that were Arab. 5 out of 600. So less than 1%. So it was definitely hard for me to do it all on my own, to embrace my own culture. And I guess that's why I had 2 personalities. She could not think of any time she saw her experiences reflected in the curriculum. And when this professor asked her if she was to move to a new school and was asked to introduce herself, would she bring in the Arab part of her identity? Her response was that mentioning her ethnicity would be undesirable. And this is sad. If a student feels uncomfortable even mentioning her ethnic identity, or what country she comes from, or what country her parents were born in, I mean, this already implies a sense of trying to conform, trying not to appear different, even though inevitably most Arab students, already because of their slightly darker than average or browner than average skin color and some facial features, and of course the fact that they have brown eyes, not green or blue, will appear different, and then partly also given the way they dress, especially girls. Uh, at school, I feel that's just people automatically just judge abruptly. Not that I'm ashamed of it, but people just automatically go off. Another student found the religious aspect of her identity the most estranging, in other words, setting her apart. The hijab she wears became a constant reminder of foreignness. So this student apparently is from the United Arab Emirates, one of the most famous countries of the Persian Gulf region. I came when I was wearing the hijab because I already wore it in Dubai, and so I did find a lot of really odd questions that I've never been exposed to before. It is just a bit extreme here, and I didn't like that at first. And there were situations where I kind of wanted to move back, but then I think over the time I had to adapt to what they say and stand up for myself. Students were also aware of how some forms of media reinforced uneducated and extreme ideas about the hijab, Islam, and Muslim women. Such views are continuous challenges for Arab female students. So the hijab that supposedly all Muslim girls and women are forced to wear it, no. In North America, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand, meaning the Western countries, there are some liberal Muslim women and girls who don't wear the hijab, although they are in a minority. And then Islam, basically, that Islam is virtually uniform around the world, which certainly is not true. In Southeastern Europe, there are some Muslims, especially in Bosnia-Herzegovina, who eat pork and drink liquor, even though the conservative Muslim communities, especially the Orthodox Muslim communities, forbid both. And most Muslims, and this I actually remember from the spring of 2002, when an Israeli Arab Christian man who was born into a Muslim family and who grew up Muslim but then became a Christian, I think, in the late 1970s or early 1980s. He told us in a young people's Christian Christian evening, a meeting, an informal gathering. He told us that most Muslims are nominal Muslims. In other words, I would define that as being Muslims basically because they happen to come from majority Muslim nations or communities. They don't take the Quran very seriously. They certainly don't closely observe the dietary rules, with the partial or possible exception of not eating pork. And they certainly don't pray 5 times per day unless they are required to. And if they can decide, they would much rather go out and party on Fridays than go to the mosque. And then there are the so-called religious Muslims who already take the Quran and its rules, including those of diet and prayers, much more seriously. And then there are the fundamentalist Muslims who most actively and violently, if necessary, are ready to spread Islam. But most Muslims are not such ones. And then women, meaning that everywhere, regardless of where the Muslim communities are found, even in the democratic Western countries, women are always oppressed, which of course is not true. Yes, it is true that the Muslim cultures are clearly more or much more patriarchal, depending on which particular Muslim cultural strands we're talking about, than are the Western cultures. But just to stereotype a Muslim family, for example, as being automatically oppressive to women and girls is certainly not fair because it's not accurate. In the liberal Muslim families, there is a great deal of gender equality, I would assume, at least compared to the conservative, let alone the fundamentalist Muslim families. But since we have these alternative right wing, far right, and populist media outlets, and since it's possible to use YouTube for broadcasting, such views on YouTube rarely censors such broadcasts unless there are complaints. These kinds of stereotypes are reinforced, especially in the minds of those people who have a black and white either or mindset, regardless of the issue, who never even think that there might be a third answer or middle ground. Another female student spoke of stereotypical representations linking Arabs with terrorism and violence. All the students sought a curriculum that is more directed towards understanding the roots of global conflict, but none could recall any such experience. One student discussed being singled out in class by social studies teachers due to assumptions the student had a personal experience of war. When we study about war and stuff, they would always ask me certain questions and certain situations if I've been in them. Some of them are extremely stereotyped. It gets hard to explain because media has affected how people see things nowadays. This moment of classroom interaction seems to show a misguided and misinformed attempt at culturally responsive teaching. None of the students talked about the classroom as a productive space for cultural discussion and deconstructing misconceptions, or for addressing a rise in hate crimes or Islamophobia in Alberta. Some students suggested a way to resolve misunderstandings about cultural differences could be through writing an assignment. I want to explain to my Canadian friends that my culture is not what they see on the media, all the stereotypes. I want to let them know more about my culture and how it actually is in reality. Schools could create classroom practices that clarify uninformed opinions about religion, challenge racialized stereotypes, and allow more focus on common grounds. But this curriculum has yet to be envisioned. Sad to say, in such a multicultural and diverse and tolerant country, at least outwardly tolerant country, as Canada is. This article was published already on May the 8th, 2019.